David Tucker had exactly 4 things left in this world. A tattered backpack that smelled of exhaust and survival. A grease-stained manual, titled, Pratt & Whitney Turbofan Engine Maintenance, that his father had annotated in pencil for 15 years. The memory of his father's last words, "Son, machines don't lie, people do. Trust what you hear in the metal," and the certainty that tonight, in the savage Chicago winter, he would either find shelter or freeze to death. He'd been homeless for 9 months when he slipped into Douglas Smith's private hangar that night, just looking for somewhere dry to sleep, while the Billionaire'S team of million-dollar engineers stood baffled around his broken Boeing business jet. But when he heard the wrong harmonics in that exposed engine, when he recognized the deliberate sabotage they'd all missed, the metallurgical murder designed to kill, he knew he couldn't stay silent. The $85 million jet was supposed to crash. Someone wanted the billionaire and his family dead, and the only person who could stop it was a 15-year-old homeless black boy who'd learned to read engines like music, who everyone dismissed as street trash, and who was about to save them all with 5 simple words. "Sir, if you let me, I can fix this." David Tucker's voice cut through the skepticism like a scalpel. "Third stage high-pressure compressor blade," he said. His words precise despite the tremor of cold and hunger. "Microscopic fatigue, crack at the blade root. Deliberate cyclic stress application." He clutched his father's manual tighter. Pratt & Whitney PW 800 series. The crack would be at the dovetail attachment point. Standard borescope inspection wouldn't catch it, you'd be looking from the wrong angle. Dr. Gerald Hampton, the MIT engineer with the Rolls-Royce pedigree, laughed. Not a chuckle, a full, condescending bark. "That's impossible. We ran full vibrational analysis, metallurgical testing, spectroscopic imaging. There's no crack." David didn't flinch. 9 months on the streets had taught him when to fight and when to fold. Right now, with his father's voice echoing "machines don't lie, people do," he knew he was right. He'd heard the truth in the metal, the same way Jerome Tucker had taught him to hear it. "Did you check for anomalous vibration signatures in the maintenance logs from 3 weeks ago?" David's voice was quiet but carried weight. There would be a spike, brief, maybe 3 to 5 seconds. High-frequency oscillation that wouldn't register as a fault but would show in the raw data stream. Hampton's smile faltered. Catherine Pierce stopped reaching for her phone. Douglas Smith's eyes narrowed with the sharp calculation that had built a $2.3 billion empire. "How would you know that?" "Because that's when the crack was induced. Someone applied deliberate, cyclic stress to weaken the metal. The vibration signature would be there, right after maintenance, right after someone had access to that engine." David's grip tightened on the manual, his father's handwriting visible on the worn pages. "It's the only explanation that fits the failure pattern." Douglas pulled a tablet from his briefcase, fingers moving across the screen. "Maintenance logs, 3 weeks ago." He scrolled, then stopped. His face went still. "There," David said. "Around 1437 hours. High-frequency vibration, 3.2 seconds. Douglas turned the tablet. The graph showed exactly what David described: a spike, brief and sharp, right after a maintenance entry signed by Vincent Torres. "Routine inspection," Douglas read. "No anomalies noted." He looked at Hampton. "You didn't see this." Hampton paled. "That's within normal parameters." "It's not normal," David interrupted. "Not for a PW 800 at idle. Not unless someone was doing something they shouldn't." Douglas stared at David, then checked his watch. 30 minutes. Prove this diagnosis. If you're right, we'll talk. If you're wrong, you're arrested for trespassing." He gestured to Frank Garrison. "Give him whatever he needs." David nodded. His hands shook from cold, hunger, the weight of his gamble. "I need a fiber optic borescope, the flexible kind. I need to access from the combustion chamber side." Hampton frowned. "That's backwards." "Your protocol missed it," David said flatly. "My father taught me a different way." Douglas made a decision. Do it. 20 minutes later, David lay beneath the engine, borescope cable snaking through the combustion chamber access panel, eyes on the monitor. His father's manual lay open beside him. Jerome Tucker's pencil annotations, visible in the harsh LED light. The hangar had gone silent, except for the wind howling outside and the soft hum of the diagnostic equipment. David's hands moved with practiced precision, guiding the fiber optic probe deeper into the engine's heart. The engineers stood in a semicircle behind him, watching the monitor. "Doctor." Hampton had his arms crossed, still skeptical. Douglas Smith stood perfectly still, watching everything. The monitor showed titanium and steel, the intricate geometry of the turbine blade assembly. David adjusted the angle once. Twice. His breathing had slowed, entering the focus state his father had taught him, where the engine became language, where metal spoke truth. The blade surfaces gleamed on screen, perfect, smooth, factory, precise. Exactly what the other engineers had seen. Exactly what they'd expected to keep seeing. Then, David rotated the borescope head 3 degrees clockwise, changing the angle of light incidence. There, a hairline fracture, barely visible even with magnification, running along the dovetail route. The crack followed the metal's grain structure, which meant it had propagated along a weakness in the crystalline lattice. But the edges were too clean, too geometric, too precise for natural fatigue. "Got it," David said quietly. The room exploded. Engineers surged forward, crowding the monitor. Hampton stared, his professional confidence crumbling into horror. Someone swore. Someone else grabbed a phone, already calling Boeing's emergency technical line. Douglas Smith crouched down next to David, looking at the image. "We were using the standard inspection angle, compressor inlet side. We wouldn't have seen." He trailed off, then looked at David with something that might have been grudging respect, or might have been fear. "Where did you learn that technique?" "My father," David said. He didn't elaborate. Douglas straightened. "What do you want?" David pulled himself out from under the engine, wiping grease on his already filthy jeans. He met Douglas's eyes directly. "Minimum wage, 3 meals a day. And if I find sabotage, and I'm going to find sabotage, you have to listen to me. Not your engineers. Not your security. Me." Douglas studied him. "That's it. That's all you want." "That's all I need," David said. Before Douglas could respond, a woman's voice cut through the tension. "Douglas, what's going on?" Rachel Smith stood in the hangar entrance, snowflakes melting in her dark hair. 50, elegant, radiating the authority of a former public defender. Her eyes swept the scene and landed on her husband. "We found the problem," Douglas said. "He found it." He gestured at David. Rachel moved closer, studying David. "Who are you?" "David Tucker, ma'am. Where did you learn to diagnose jet engines?" The question was gentle, but weighted. David felt something crack inside. "My father, Jerome Tucker, American Airlines mechanic, 23 years, was." Rachel's voice softened. "Died 9 months ago. County hospital waiting room. If he'd had insurance, if he could have afforded insulin." He stopped. Swallowed. "He spent 15 years teaching me everything. Used to say I was his legacy. I'm trying to make that mean something." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. She didn't look away. Douglas's expression hardened with resolve. "You'll get your 3 meals, Douglas said. "Minimum wage, and we'll listen. Now show me the sabotage." David turned back to the engine. His hands were steadier now. He had permission. He had tools. He had a chance to make his father's death mean something. He examined the compressor housing with precision that would have made Jerome Tucker proud, running his fingers along the seams, checking for marks that didn't belong. And their faint scratches, fresh, inconsistent with standard maintenance. "Someone opened this recently," David said. "Non-standard tools. See the scoring pattern," he pointed. "That's from a pry bar or modified wrench, not regulation equipment." He retrieved a dental mirror and LED pen light from the tool cart Frank had provided. Working carefully, he angled the mirror to examine the blade root from multiple positions. The metal surface looked perfect at first glance, but they're barely visible even under direct light. 3 tiny imperfections. "Micro holes," David said, his voice tight. 3 of them, drilled into the blade root. Hampton leaned in. "I don't see." "Because they're filled." David touched the blade surface with a gloved finger, felt the almost imperceptible texture difference. Some kind of compound. Designed to dissolve under heat stress. When the engine runs at operating temperature, the compound melts away, leaves the holes, creates stress concentration points. The blade develops a fatigue crack. Eventually, he didn't need to finish. The silence was profound. "Catastrophic failure," Hampton whispered. "At altitude. Jesus Christ. The entire engine would have disintegrated," David confirmed. "Probably over the Rockies." The debris field would be scattered across 10 miles of mountain terrain. By the time investigators found the wreckage, the compound would be long gone. Just looks like metal fatigue. Maintenance oversight. Nobody's fault. Douglas's voice was very quiet. This wasn't an accident. No, sir. David looked up at the billionaire whose life he'd just saved. Someone tried to kill you, and they knew exactly what they were doing. Rachel's hand found her husband's arm, grip white-knuckled. Douglas, I know. Douglas's face had paled, but his voice remained steady. He looked at David Tucker, 15 years old, homeless, starving, brilliant, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. You're hired. And you're not leaving this hangar until we find out who did this. The first move came 90 minutes later, while David documented the sabotage with Frank Garrison's camera. Hey, kid, Vincent Torres's voice carried across the hangar. You dropped something. David looked up. Vincent held David's tattered backpack, smile not reaching his eyes. I'll bring it over. Frank Garrison intercepted him in 3 strides. I'll take that. The backpack changed hands. Frank opened it methodically. His expression didn't change when he found the plastic bag of white powder in the broken front pocket. Interesting, Frank said. He looked at Vincent. Street value maybe $300. Strange for a homeless kid not to sell it. Vincent's face shifted to indignant. See? Call the cops. Empty your pockets, Frank interrupted. You can't. This is my property, Douglas said. Empty them, or leave. Vincent's hand moved toward his jacket. Frank was on him instantly. Textbook takedown. Knee in back. Zip ties on wrists. From Vincent's jacket, Frank pulled an unmarked smartphone. Military-grade encrypted hardware. Let's talk about who you've been calling, Frank said. David watched Vincent's face cycle through emotions, landing on a nervous younger mechanic across the workspace. Jorge Mendez, trapped animal look, barely controlled trembling. David recognized fear. 9 months on the streets had made him an expert. While Frank secured Vincent, David approached Jorge, who was pretending to organize tools with shaking hands. They're threatening your family, aren't they? David said softly. Jorge spun, pale. I know what fear looks like. I've been afraid every day for 9 months. David's voice was gentle. You're afraid of something worse. Jorge crumbled. My mother, my sister, Honduras. These men showed me pictures, their address. Said if I didn't help Vincent. His voice broke. What was I supposed to do? Tell me everything, before more people die. Marcus Devereaux had paid Vincent $500,000 to sabotage the plane, to kill. Jorge was coerced through threats, used for access during maintenance, made complicit. How many devices? David demanded. I don't know. The compressor blade, yes, but Vincent said there were backups. He kept saying the package has to be delivered at altitude. Show me where you did the work, David said. 20 minutes later, David was back inside the engine nacelle, with Jorge guiding him to a fuel flow sensor housing near the high-pressure fuel pump. The component looked factory original, correct part number, proper torque striping on the mounting bolts, official FAA certification tag. David's instincts screamed wrong. He removed it anyway, fingers working the precision fasteners with practiced care. The internals were wrong, completely wrong, too sophisticated. The circuit board had components that didn't belong in a fuel sensor, wireless transmission capability, encrypted processing chips, autonomous operation parameters. This wasn't monitoring fuel flow, this was controlling it. This isn't a sensor, David said, his voice tight with controlled fear. This is a trigger device. It's designed to cause an overspeed condition at altitude. Force the engine into an uncontrolled acceleration cycle. Douglas, watching over David's shoulder, went very still. He took the component carefully, turning it under the work light. His face hardened with recognition and horror. This is military hardware. Spec classified. My company manufactures the civilian variants for defense contracts. His eyes met David's, and for the first time, the billionaire looked genuinely afraid. Devereaux has access to our supply chain. He's been planning this for months, maybe years. The implications hung in the air like poison gas. This wasn't opportunistic sabotage. This was methodical assassination, executed by someone with resources, patience, and terrifying reach into Douglas's own company. Mr. Smith, Catherine Pierce's voice cut across the hangar. She strode toward them with 2 security guards, and a woman in gray carrying a medical bag. This boy is clearly mentally unstable. Rachel Smith stepped into her path. "Excuse me. Mrs. Smith, Dr. Frost here is a psychiatrist. We need to touch him, and I'll sue you into bankruptcy," Rachel said quietly. "I spent 10 years as a public defender. I know a kid telling the truth. I also know what a guilty person sounds like when they're trying too hard to discredit a witness." Catherine's composure cracked. "I'm trying to protect Mr. Smith from what? From the boy who found sabotage your experts missed?" Rachel stepped closer. "Or are you protecting Marcus Devereaux's investment?" Catherine went white. "I don't. How dare you?" The timeline alone makes that impossible because the Singapore deal wasn't finalized until she stopped. Too late. Frank moved. Nobody mentioned Singapore. Nobody mentioned Devereaux by name. And Singapore is confidential board information. His hand was on his radio. "Catherine Pierce, you're not going anywhere." Catherine looked trapped. "Devereaux's going to destroy this company anyway. I was trying to survive. By helping him murder my family." Douglas's voice could have frozen steel. They found the third device at 3:47 a.m. David, Jorge, Frank, and Douglas had been working for 8 straight hours, systematically stripping the engine nacelle to bare metal. David's hands were cramped and bleeding from a dozen small cuts, his eyes burning from fatigue and LED glare. But his father's voice kept him focused. "Machines don't lie. Trust what you hear in the metal." The device was hidden in the engine cowling, magnetic mounted behind the fire suppression system, where standard inspections would never look. Remote triggered, sophisticated, military-grade C4 plastic explosive with a wireless detonator. Douglas examined it with shaking hands, his billionaire's composure finally cracking. C4. Maybe 4 ounces. Not enough to bring down the whole plane. But at 41,000 feet, with the cabin pressure differential, he didn't need to finish. Explosive decompression. Structural failure. His wife, his daughter, everyone dead, scattered across the Rockies in pieces too small to identify. 41,000 feet. David said quietly, understanding the full horror. "That's your standard cruising altitude for the Aspen route. Your family route." "Yes." Douglas's voice was barely audible, raw with the realization of how close he'd come to losing everything that mattered. Rachel and Emma were supposed to be on that flight. 3 days from now, Frank was already on the phone with the FBI. Federal agents arrived 30 minutes later, including a forensics team that traced the device's components to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, owned by Marcus Devereaux. The hangar transformed into a crime scene. FBI agents, evidence markers, photographers. But Vincent Torres was gone, bolted when the feds showed, Frank reported. Maintenance tunnels. David was moving before anyone could stop him. 9 months of survival had taught him every warm passage in Chicago's industrial infrastructure. Vincent was destroying evidence. The maintenance facility was a warren connecting hangars to utilities. David slipped through a service door, heard voices ahead. His foot caught a pipe, metal clanging. "Who's there?" Vincent called. David ran. Footsteps thundered behind. The tunnel branched. David went left, then right, using memory. But they knew these spaces too. They cornered him near the electrical substation. Vincent and 2 men. Bigger, desperate. "Should have stayed on the street, kid," Vincent said. David's back hit concrete. 3 of them, 1 exit. But there was a ventilation shaft above, narrow, rusted. David jumped, grabbed the grating, pulled hard. Metal shrieked. Vincent lunged. David pulled harder. The grating tore free. He scrambled into darkness, metal scraping skin. Vincent's hand caught his ankle. David kicked, connected, pulled higher. The shaft led up, then horizontal. David crawled until he found a fire alarm. He yanked it. Sirens exploded. Emergency lighting flared. Vincent cursed and ran. David emerged dirty and bleeding. Federal agents were dragging Vincent out in handcuffs. Frank helped David up. "Bravest kid I've ever met, or the dumbest? Both, probably." Douglas appeared, saw David's torn jacket and bleeding arms. "Get him cleaned up, fed, somewhere safe to sleep. Somewhere that's not the street." For the first time in 9 months, David Tucker didn't have to wonder where he'd sleep. The rebuild took 48 hours that felt like 48 days. David worked until his hands bled. until Frank had to force him to eat. Jorge worked beside him, guilt-driven, double-checking everything. A small team of vetted mechanics rotated through shifts, but David never left. Neither did Douglas Smith. The billionaire learned to take orders from a 15-year-old. When David said, "Hand me the torque wrench," Douglas handed it. When David said, "Hold this steady," Douglas held it. No ego, just competence. Recognizing competence. Rachel appeared every 6 hours with coffee and food, deep dish pizza, Italian beef, substance that mattered. She never asked if they needed it. Just left it and watched David eat. On the second night, Emma came, 12 years old, curious, fearless. She sat cross-legged during David's break, asking rapid-fire questions. Why do the blades have to be that exact angle? Airflow velocity creates pressure differential. The angle determines compression efficiency. What happens if one breaks? Catastrophic unbalance. Engine tears itself apart in 2 seconds. Is that what almost happened to Dad's plane? David looked at this girl who'd almost lost her father. Yes. But we stopped it. Emma studied him with eyes too old for 12. You saved my dad. I found the problem. Your dad had courage to listen. You're flying with him to test it. Yes, good. Because if anything's wrong, you should be there to fix it. Rachel called in her law school roommate, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michelle Zhao, who arrived with FBI agents and prosecutorial intensity. We need evidence for federal court, Michelle said. Multiple counts of attempted murder, conspiracy, espionage. Devereaux has expensive lawyers. We need this airtight. What do you need? Douglas asked. A controlled test flight. Document everything. Prove the sabotage would have been fatal. Prove your aircraft is safe now. Michelle's expression was grim. Risky. But it's the only way to demonstrate murderous intent beyond reasonable doubt. I'll pilot, Douglas said immediately. I'm going with you, David added. If I'm wrong, I should pay the price. Absolutely not, Rachel said. Arms crossed. Prosecutor face on. Yes, I am. David's voice was quiet. If something goes wrong, I'm the only one who can fix it in the air. And because my father spent his whole life making sure planes were safe, making sure people got home, I need to finish what he started. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. The pre-flight inspection took 3 hours. David checked every system personally. Frank worked beside him with a 14-page checklist. Douglas reviewed flight systems. FBI agent Martinez documented everything. Emma and Rachel watched through the observation room window, holding each other. Before boarding, Rachel found a way past security. She hugged David hard. You bring my husband back, you hear me? Yes, ma'am. The Boeing business jet sat on the tarmac, promise or threat, depending on perspective. Morning sun gleamed off its fuselage. The rebuilt engine sat silent and ready. Douglas took the pilot's seat. David sat behind him, headset on, eyes on every gauge. Frank and Martinez strapped in at the rear with cameras and recording equipment. Chicago Executive Tower, November 77 Delta Sierra, requesting takeoff clearance. November 77 Delta Sierra, cleared for takeoff runway 26. The engine spooled up. David listened with every fiber of his being. The sound was perfect. Clean. Powerful. Precise. They rolled. The runway blurred. Chicago fell away beneath them. Climb was smooth. 10,000 feet. 20,000. The engine ran flawlessly. At 35,000 feet, David heard it. Not the engine. Something else. High-frequency vibration. Intermittent. From below. Stop the climb, David said. Douglas leveled off immediately. What is it? Don't know yet. David was already unbuckling, moving to the cabin floor. But it's wrong. The landing gear bay. David pressed his ear to the deck. The vibration was stronger here. He pulled the access panel, shone a flashlight into the hydraulic lines. There, a sixth device. Smaller, cruder, but just as deadly. Attached to the main hydraulic lines with zip ties and duct tape, a mechanical blade positioned to sever the lines when landing gear extended. Without hydraulics, they couldn't extend gear or control flaps. Belly landing at 150 miles per hour. Terrible odds. David's hands shook, but his mind was clear. His father's training took over. Martinez, film this. Every angle. 10 minutes later, the device was disarmed, photographed, bagged. 41,000 feet, Douglas said from the cockpit, voice steady despite everything they'd just found. We're at altitude. This was the moment. The proof they needed. The evidence that would send Devereaux and his conspirators to federal prison for life. Martinez pulled out a remote trigger, the detonator for the C4 device they'd already disarmed and documented. They'd left the trigger circuit active for exactly this purpose, to prove intent, to prove murder, to capture on camera the moment someone tried to kill everyone on this aircraft. On 3, Martinez said, positioning cameras to capture every angle. 1, 2, 3. He pressed the button. The device sparked deep in the engine, cowling. Electricity arced through disabled circuits, trying to complete a sequence that would have detonated 4 ounces of C4 at cruising altitude. Trying to blow a hole in the aircraft that would cause catastrophic decompression, structural failure, and certain death for everyone aboard. But nothing exploded, just sparks. Just proof, irrefutable, documented, captured on multiple high-definition cameras that someone had tried to murder everyone on this plane. Douglas's voice was steady as granite when he keyed the radio. Chicago Executive Tower. This is November 77 Delta Sierra. We have evidence of attempted sabotage and murder. Request priority handling and FBI presence on the ground. There was a long pause. Then, November 7 Delta Sierra. Roger. You are cleared. Direct, Chicago Executive. Priority handling. Emergency vehicles standing by. FBI has been notified. The landing was perfect. David's repairs held. The engine that 3 weeks of experts couldn't fix, that a homeless boy had rebuilt in 48 sleepless hours, performed flawlessly. Federal vehicles ringed the tarmac. FBI, Chicago PD, Homeland Security, U.S. Marshals. And in the center, in handcuffs, 3 people who'd gambled on murder: Vincent Torres, Catherine Pierce, and Marcus Devereaux. David stepped off the plane, legs shaking. Rachel and Emma ran to Douglas, holding him tight. Marcus Devereaux watched with stunned disbelief, his perfect plan destroyed by the one variable he'd never considered. When he saw David, this thin black teenager, in a borrowed jacket, grease under his fingernails, exhaustion in his eyes, his face went slack. A homeless kid, Devereaux said hollowly. I was brought down by a homeless kid. David walked toward him slowly. Federal agents stepped aside. The tarmac went quiet. David stopped 3 feet from the man who'd orchestrated murder. My father's name was Jerome Tucker, David said quietly, his voice carrying. Airline mechanic for 23 years. He taught me everything before your broken system killed him. Before corporate greed and insurance companies decided his life wasn't worth $300 of insulin. His eyes never left Devereaux's face. He was worth 10 of you, 100 of you. You're going to spend the rest of your life in federal prison knowing that his legacy, his son, is why you're there. Knowing everything you built meant nothing against what he gave me. Devereaux had no response. They took him away in handcuffs, loaded into a federal transport with Torres and Pierce. The van pulled away, and David Tucker, homeless no more, invisible no more, watched them go. Douglas appeared beside him, hand on his shoulder. No words, just acknowledgement. Frank, Jorge, Rachel, and Emma gathered close. Strangers who'd become something else. Something that mattered. Come on, Rachel said gently. Let's go home. Home. David tested the word. 9 months without one, 9 months sleeping in alleys and tunnels, 9 months being invisible. But Rachel was looking at him like he mattered, like he belonged. Yeah, David said. Let's go home. The hangar felt different now, quieter, safer. David sat on a folding chair, wrapped in an emergency blanket, eating deep dish pizza Rachel had brought. It was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Not because the pizza was extraordinary, though it was, but because he wasn't eating alone in an alley, wasn't calculating how to stretch the leftovers. He was just eating, like someone who mattered. Emma sat beside him, firing questions with relentless enthusiasm. So the compressor stages multiply pressure. But how does the turbine extract energy without losing thrust? David swallowed. The turbine drives the compressor, takes just enough energy to keep the cycle running, the rest becomes thrust. and bypass ratio determines efficiency. For subsonic flight, higher bypass means efficient cruise, lower top speed. Emma's eyes lit up. I want to design engines, not just fix them. She looked at Douglas, 20 feet away on his phone. Dad builds companies. Mom defended people. I'm going to build engines that don't kill people. David felt something shift. Purpose, legacy. The understanding that Jerome Tucker's knowledge wasn't meant to stop with David. You're going to be amazing, he said. Douglas finished his call and walked over, exhaustion and relief on his face. His company was safe. His family was alive. I need to offer you 3 things, Douglas said, pulling over a chair. Listen before you say no. David set down the pizza. I'm listening. First, legal guardianship. You'll live with my family until you're 18. No foster system, a room of your own. David's throat tightened. He nodded. Second, full scholarship to Northwestern's engineering program. High school completion, then aerospace. You'll also work part-time in my R&D division. Real engineering work. David's hands shook. Third, I'm starting a foundation in your father's name. The Jerome Tucker Second Chance Aviation Initiative. We'll train 100 kids every year. Kids the system has failed. Teach them what your father taught you. Douglas extended his hand. You gave me a second chance, David. Let me return it. David took his hand. Yes. Yes to all of it. Emma threw her arms around him. Rachel appeared, crying and smiling, and for the first time since Jerome Tucker died, David could breathe. The federal prosecution moved with inexorable weight. Marcus Devereaux received 45 years. Catherine Pierce got 22. Vincent Torres, 18. Despite cooperation, Jorge Mendez received probation and a job in Douglas's training program. The FBI moved his family from Honduras to Chicago under protection. The FAA established the Tucker Protocol, new inspection procedures for sophisticated sabotage. David's unconventional techniques became mandatory training worldwide. Jerome Tucker's manual annotations were distributed to every major airline. David testified before Congress at 15, wearing a suit Rachel bought him. He spoke about aviation security and unconventional expertise. The video went viral, not because it was dramatic, because it was true. 6 months later, David stood in a converted hangar on Chicago's South Side, facing 25 teenagers who looked exactly like he'd looked 6 months ago. Hollow cheeks, suspicious eyes, defensive postures. Kids from the streets, from foster care, from situations where the system had failed them so completely they'd learned not to trust anything. He was wearing a Northwestern engineering hoodie now. He'd gained 20 healthy pounds. His hair was cut, his hands clean, though scarred from that 48-hour rebuild. He lived in Winnetka with the Smiths, in a room with his own bed and desk, and posters of turbofan engines on the walls. Emma had put them up as a surprise. David held his father's manual, preserved in archival plastic but still his constant companion. Jerome Tucker's handwriting visible through the protective covering. Still teaching, still guiding, still proving that one man's knowledge could change everything. My father used to say, machines don't lie, people do, David told the class. 25 pairs of eyes locked on him with recognition. They understood. They'd been lied to their whole lives. I'm here to teach you the language machines speak. Engines. Hydraulics. Avionics. Systems that tell the truth, if you know how to listen. He opened the manual to a heavily annotated page. But I'm also here to tell you that some people don't lie. Some people see you, and when you find those people, you hold on. He looked toward the back where Douglas stood next to Rachel and Emma, where Frank Garrison leaned against the wall with something like pride on his face. His family now. The people who'd chosen to see him when the world had decided he was invisible. Now, David said, turning back to his students, his legacy, his father's legacy, continuing forward through these 25 lives that would touch hundreds more. Let's talk about turbine engines. The class ran for 3 hours. David taught compression ratios and blade dynamics and the physics of thrust. He taught tool marks and vibration signatures and the dozen details that separated competence from excellence. He taught them using his father's words, his father's examples, his father's passion for making sure people got home safely, and most importantly, he taught them that they mattered, that their knowledge, their perspective, their unconventional paths to this room, all of it mattered. That the system that had failed them didn't get to define their worth or limit their potential. When the students filed out, chattering excitedly about compression ratios and bypass fans and their next session, Frank pulled David aside. His expression was serious in the way that meant someone was in danger. FBI found something, Frank said quietly. Seventh device. Different plane. Senator's aircraft. Private jet coming into O'Hare tomorrow morning from D.C. Same signature, same technique, copycat, or someone we missed. David's hands tightened on his father's manual. The same instinct that had driven him into Douglas's hangar 6 months ago flared to life. Someone else was in danger. Someone else needed the truth that metal could tell. And he had the knowledge, the skill, the responsibility to answer that call. He looked at the manual in his hands. Jerome Tucker's legacy. Now his legacy. Soon to be the legacy of 25 more students, who would teach 25 more after that. He looked at his students heading out to their new lives, to futures that had seemed impossible before today. He looked at Douglas, watching from across the room. At Emma, standing beside her father with her aerospace engineering textbook under her arm. At Frank, waiting for his answer. 6 months ago, David had been homeless, invisible, desperate. He'd slipped into a hangar seeking nothing more than shelter from the cold, and he'd found everything. Family, purpose, the chance to make his father's death mean something beyond grief. But the work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. Because as long as people built machines, someone needed to make sure those machines told the truth. Someone needed to listen to what the metal was trying to say. Machines don't lie, David said, meeting Frank's eyes with the same certainty he'd shown that first night when he'd walked up to a circle of dismissive engineers and said 5 words that changed everything. Let's go listen. They walked toward another hangar together. David Tucker, no longer homeless, no longer invisible, no longer the boy everyone dismissed, student and teacher, saved and savior. His father's son, in every way that mattered. The metal was calling. Someone needed help. And David Tucker, carrying Jerome Tucker's knowledge and integrity forward into the world, was ready to answer. Because this was who he was now. This was who he'd always been, underneath the hunger and the cold and the months of survival. Someone who listened to machines. Someone who heard the truth. Someone who saved lives. His father would be proud. To all my amazing viewers, thank you. Every time you watch, like, and share my videos, you keep the echoes of love alive. Your support, your comments, and your time mean more than you know. This channel exists because of you. I appreciate you deeply.